And so that's why organizations get boring and crappy when they're big and stop building new things. You really have to like be encouraging, especially as you get bigger and you have lots of users and stuff. You have to go out of your way to encourage ideas rather than everything going a bit sensible and boring and then you hitting some local maxima with what you're working on. Like a matter of pride starts motivating people.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling Dev Tools. I am joined today by James Hawkins from PostHog, who is one of our first returning guests. And James, you've been quite busy since we spoke a year and a half ago. We were just catching up. Could you share a little bit about PostHog and what you've been up to in the last year and a half?
Sure. Yeah. So PostHog is a platform that lets engineers build successful products. We try and give you all the tools you need in one. Where we started building in 2020, kind of just before COVID hit. And I've forgotten the second part of your question.
My second part was what you've been up to since then. Well, I can actually say partly because I can say that just today, the project I'm working on, the other engineer was like, we should install PostHog. And there wasn't even, I was like, I'm interviewing James from PostHog later as well. So I'm using it today and it's really good. We're using session recording. And then the company I do contracting with are also using it completely independent of me. I'm not using it. The other team is using it. And they're like getting on really well with it. And doing all sorts of compliance stuff as well. So
good. Yeah, I've also no, I'm glad to hear it. I can I also endorse PostHog too. And I have double the number of children I have since last time to 2. And I will be having no more.
So yeah, and I can imagine that you so we're gonna dig in, but I'll share one quick anecdote researching James. So to give you a background on James as a person, James in 2020 wrote an article about hoovering and the mental overhead of monitoring when hoovering needs to be done. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about that as like a...
Sure. So on hoovering, when I was young, I'd be like, why is my wife so pissed off that I haven't I was like, I'm always happy to do the hoovering. So why is she annoyed about it? I don't understand. And then she's like, well, James, the thing is you're not actually thinking about it or maintaining the house, whatever. You're just following instructions, which is much simpler and it's not tiring and it doesn't take the same amount of energy. It's a bit like being a passenger in a car compared to the driver. And so I think this analogy is useful when you think about kind of, who's when we're hiring, for example, we're looking for this kind of mentality of is this the person that's going to realize that the hoovering needs doing, or is this the person that will just do hoovering if asked? And there's a world of difference between the two. And when you scale up a business, if everyone is the kind of person that would realize that hoovering needs doing, the company kind of runs in this weird autonomous distributed kind of way, and it makes it much less stressful, which gives you space to think about your strategy or hiring or fundraising or whatever else that you need to do that you maybe aren't delegating.
Yeah, and so I think this leads us on to 2 things. And the first thing that we'll come back to is about hiring the right people and how you run the organizations. But I think something to kind of keep in mind for the listener as you go through that I'm thinking about is just noticing how everything that James does, he's thinking about a level of abstraction above. And I think this is really uncommon. And I think it seems from the outside to be something that PostHog is really good at. And yeah, so that's so awesome, James, by the way.
We put quite a lot of work into it. We have a public handbook that explains how we work, which I think has helped us to think like this. So for example, every time we have a particular problem, we try and create some kind of principle around it. And the situation would be something like a team member has asked to go on a 3-month sabbatical. And instead of just we just won't solve for that team member, we'll solve for the company. So we go, well, in general, how do we handle people asking for sabbaticals? What's our philosophy around this? And then whatever the output is, we'll put it into the handbook of the business. And the next time we don't have to think about it. And then occasionally we'll revise stuff if one of our various philosophies turns out to be pretty stupid. Again, a book Ray Dalio has a book on principles, which I think I read long after we started doing this handbook. But it was quite affirming. I was like, oh, actually, yeah, I can totally see that he has a similar mentality, for example, and is much more eloquent than me. So you should go read his book.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. At some point, you're going to land a big customer and they're going to ask you for enterprise features. That's where WorkOS comes in because they give you these features out the box. Features like skim provisioning, SAML authentication, and audit logs. They have an easy-to-use API and they're trusted by big dev tools like Vercel as well as smaller, fast-growing dev tools like Knock. So if you're looking to cross the enterprise chasm and make yourself enterprise ready, check out WorkOS. We've also done an episode with Michael, the founder of WorkOS, where he shares a lot of tips around crossing the enterprise chasm, landing your first enterprise deals, and making sure that you're ready for them. Thanks WorkOS for sponsoring the podcast, and back to the show. Yeah, that's interesting. And then going back to so speaking about how you hire people that are willing to check when the hoovering needs to be done as well. When we were talking about doing this episode, one of the things that you were mentioning was that you're aggressively trying to remove one-on-one meetings. And I know you were already doing very few meetings as a company. Could you talk a bit about why you think that's important and how you do it?
One of the questions we asked ourselves internally is kind of like, what are we winning on as a business? Like, what is the competency we need? Like, what are the competencies we need? And we're questioning, like, is it design? Like, how much does that matter to us? Whatever. And eventually we kind of realized, again, because some decisions are like, okay, we're optimizing for design quality and control, or we're optimizing for something else. And eventually we realized, oh, okay, speed matters to us. We're trying to build every tool that developers need to build a successful product. So that means like a crap ton of tools. Like we need to really ship an awful lot, like much more than a normal company. And like today we have, we've just started hiring quite a bit. I think we're now like 47 or 50 people or something. And we have 8 products. And like each individual product, we're usually competing with a team of a couple of hundred people who are only working on that product. And so we've been really good at shipping a like ridiculous amount of surface area per person that works here. When it comes to kind of hiring people and stuff like that, I guess we're basically structured in small teams, and each team operates like a small startup. And the principle, like we kind of borrowed from we did Y Combinator in 2020, and we're like, okay, like at YC there were like 250 companies, or about 500 people roughly, and 250 products got built, which is a really good ratio. And it's like, why is that? Well, people have a lot of autonomy, they have ownership, like the people who are there are quite intrinsically motivated, they're all kind of product engineer type people. And so we kind of thought like, well, actually I think they're getting it right in terms of the amount of stuff that's getting built in that kind of structure.
Interesting, yeah.
So we have a team for every product that we build. The team's multidisciplinary, and the concept is they can ship without outside interference. So they need no permission to go outside of their team to do anything, like as far as humanly possible. We give now we're a bit bigger. We track every product has its own growth review where we go through all the metrics and stuff. And we're kind of like, my mentality is we're just trying to coach these teams. We put as much energy into each product. We don't just base it on like the one that's the biggest or the most successful or whatever financially. And we hire quite entrepreneurial developers. Like I think this is correct, but I might get a fact check. I think it's like 40% of our team have been founders before or something like that. But they're all technical people too. And so yeah, we have people that are very intrinsically motivated, who are good at just being like, cool, make something from nothing. And there's loads and loads of other stuff. Like we're all remote, and I think an autonomous environment works better when you're all remote. And like hiring people with more experience on the whole, on average, rather than less experience tends to work better, I think. And these are all lessons we've kind of learned as we've scaled and hired lots of people. But yeah, ultimately all this stuff comes down to we're trying to optimize for velocity. And so we've kind of got a structure that enables us to do that, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you describe that, like the thing it reminded me of is there's this guy, Andrew Wilkinson, who I don't know if you've heard of him, but he owns this company called Tiny, and they basically are a holding company for like many different products.
Yeah.
And he meets with the individual founders and gets like, or CEOs, and gets like updates on like their projections and stuff, and like unblocks them, helps them make key hires, all that sort of stuff. It almost sounded like that when you described it.
Yeah, it's not a million miles from being an investor in some ways. Like it, I mean, it's quite far from that, but some days I'm like, maybe at scale. Like another good example is how AWS operates. Like, AWS is doing, I checked, like last time I checked, it was like $80 billion a year in revenue or something. And they have like hundreds of products. But each product is a small team ultimately. I'm sure they have a lot more bureaucracy than us, but they have a very similar meeting system and so on. So it's kind of, and then the advantage is like when you're also like, the other thing you want when it comes to like one-on-ones and stuff, and very engineering heavy. Like again, we need to have like another core thing is in order to be quick at shipping, we need to have a really high fraction of our team as developers. So we've tried to minimize everything else. Like we don't have an outbound, we don't do any outbound sales whatsoever, for example. So we're trying to maintain a really high ratio of engineers to people who can't do engineering work, in order that we have as many people as possible writing code and building stuff. But again, like AWS has been actually a sort of source of inspiration for the way we run, even though we're like totally puny compared to them.
Yeah. Actually, throwing you like the question on like the engineers, like it's kind of easy to imagine a world where like just having engineers goes wrong. If like you're envisioning like something with no styling and they don't do any marketing and like no one uses it. It's like the kind of classic like indie hacker engineer thing. Like how do you hire like teams which are like primarily engineers and still like build products that people really want to use and that like the word spreads as well?
I think some of it's self-selection. Like we have no product design. So give you some things that are kind of shocking. Probably we have no product design by default. So we don't scope stuff out in Figma or anything before. Like literally, engineer builds it however they want. And we have no product management by default either. It changes a little bit as we get bigger. Like we don't have but the person that decides what to build is a developer at PostHog. Even above, like we have one product manager about to hire a second. They're exclusively in a coaching role. Like they do very deep data analysis and stuff, and go deeper on kind of producty questions you might have, where frankly we think a product manager would actually do a better job than a developer would. But they don't dictate the roadmap or decide things or build product requirement docs or anything. So like no product by default, no really, or at least in the conventional definition of it, and no product design by default either. So yeah, you're like, in theory, that looks like you're set up for a wreck in terms of UX and stuff. But the reality has just been that there are lots of developers who are product engineers now, and that's what they consider themselves. I think it's one. I think our product strategy is a little bit simpler than if you're building, like we're not building new, like every product that we ship into our platform, we will only ship products that already have product market fit externally on day one. The innovation becomes kind of once the product's out in an MVP or once it's got to product market fit and we're starting to make money off it and our retention's good and so on. That kind of means that it's just a little bit simpler. Like if I just told you like, hey, come up with some UX or product analytics, you would be able to do a like half-baked, kind of reasonable job pretty easily. And we're not copying stuff, but it's just like everyone's so familiar with the concepts of the tools that we build that
everyone's used to it.
Yeah, it's just like not as hard. Whereas I think if, for example, it was like we're coming up with a new, if we're like the first ever people to conceive of the idea of like a vessel to contain water or something, like that's a massive design challenge. So well, my hands are pretty good, but like that's the best I can come up with. Like, but
it just falls through, and I just
and some dude's like, no, we should like dig this thing out of the ground and like bake it and then use that to store things in or whatever. Like, so I think our product strategy enables it creates less work from a design, like product design perspective too. So that probably makes it a little bit easier. And then we also have now we've got a big user base. It means that we get into an iterative cycle with users very quickly. Like we ship something, we often ship it in like a private preview for a few customers. And then like we'll put it in like a feature preview where people opt in, then we'll roll it out gradually. And we use our own tooling and stuff to do all this stuff. So it's very quick as well to get it into users' hands. And start iterating with them. And our engineers will talk to our customers. They'll solve their support problems directly. Like we got to 100,000 users before we had any dedicated support people. And like the first guy we hired is like 18 and it's his first job or like second job or like first proper job, I guess. And now we have to 170,000 plus users. So yeah, we're pretty good at getting stuff into users' hands quickly and getting our engineers to just work with them directly. And then we're hiring for people that kind of developers that you can kind of see talking to users and you have a history of doing that kind of work. But it is a thing now. It's a trend we're actually trying to encourage. Like our tooling is designed to help other companies operate more like this, because it just gets rid of tons of bureaucracy and specialization and like handoffs between teams and alignment and meetings and bullshit. And these are all things that get in the way of engineers, like, and get in the way of developers building successful products, which is what we want to achieve.
Yeah, that's actually interesting that you. I saw on your site you have like your ICP as like a public thing, which is also like kind of actually seems obvious when you see that, like you would, of course, like you would want to make that public. But I guess no one does. But like, did you always know that that was your ICP, or like, because you are the ICP of, I think you basically describe PostHog as like the ICP of PostHog.
Yep. Yeah, we absolutely are. ICP's we've been on a big journey with like the ideal customer profile that we're shooting for. Like we've been all over the place trying to get this right. It used to come up all the time after our board meetings. It was kind of always like, who are you building for? Well, how are they reacting to it? And I was like, why are we getting asked this question like over and over and over again? And we had this guy called Ali Ragani, who's brilliant, who used to lead the continuity fund at YC. I'm like, man, I just know every board meeting we're going to like this question is going to come up and up and up and up. I think basically in the early days we're building for engineers and then kind of like startup, like engineers who worked in startups. And then we were kind of like, oh, maybe actually we're focused on self-hosting. So it's companies that they also need to work in places that care about keeping data in their infrastructure. Because all this, like we're struggling with our in cloud early on. And then eventually what happened was as our product quality went up, we realized, oh, actually, no, it is literally like, is developers building new products, whether it's in a big company or a small company. We're not like we have a self-hosted open source product, but our focus isn't that. It's like, cloud adoption. And we have like SOC 2 and HIPAA and stuff. But we had this like long journey over, we basically raised our series, I think at the end of 2020-ish, probably we started focusing on this. Because we had so much noise from the repo, because we had adoption everywhere. We had like a chain of 3 pizza restaurants in Ukraine using us, and then we have like international banks using us and stuff. And it was just like, and then we have loads of YC startups using us, and it's sort of, we had so much noise. The challenge was like, okay, who are we listening to? And then it was also like, do we care about product managers? Do we care about marketing people or growth engineers, or do we just care about engineers? And the answer wound up eventually just being like, don't we just care about engineers? These other users will use the product, but they're secondary. So no, we're not going to optimize like our pricing model or our marketing or our sales towards these other user types. We kind of, our go-to-market is basically developers insist on our product, and they're the ones who have to implement it. And because we work with new digital products, the engineers usually pick the tooling because they're the only people there. Like in a startup, a good startup usually is all technical people. So like the developers are doing every role. Like the developers are the salespeople, they're the support people, they're the marketing people. And so we're like, actually, yeah, we should just focus on developers, do a good enough job there and get enough products being adopted that it's so annoying to move off of PostHog anyway that like the other users will tolerate us. But that's what we're like, we need to be compatible with them, but we don't have to kind of market towards them or anything. It's kind of what we've learned so far. Maybe that will change at more scale, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's funny. It's kind of funny how like the conventional view is like, or you hear it all the time. It's like developers don't have buying power, and then your strategy is entirely based on like actually they have all of the buying power at the good startups, and it's I guess your belief is that it's going to change as well, in that all the best companies are.
Yeah, I think it's a direction of travel. Like we've been trying to understand in sort of like we interviewed like a bunch of like series like C, D startups at least, trying to understand like who decides what to build, like or like does the most senior product person report into the CTO ultimately? And like we're trying, and like most of the majority, like we had like a slim majority. I think it was like 5 out of 8 or something. We're like, no, yeah, it's that way around. And then like of the remaining 3, I think 2 of them were like, we're trying to make this change in favor of engineering.
Interesting.
So I think, and those were companies that aren't users. It was like random ones. And so I think
Yeah.
it was a small sample, but we've like been trying to understand this, and now it really feels like a strong trend.
It's exciting.
And we're getting engineers kind of like when we post job ads now, we have like this whole, our following is like product engineers, and so like we want to hire product engineers, like engineers who decide what to build, and tons of them apply for jobs because they know that's kind of how we work, where they'll be able to pick what they work on.
Yeah.
So it's like we're in some sort of weird pyramid hype scheme or something.
That's that's what one of the things as well you mentioned there is like the kind of like the open source projects, and how, and for people that I don't know if we touched on this, but you started out as like this open source analytics or product analytics. I don't know if that's how you describe it, but like, and that got a ton of adoption before you had any of a cloud offering, and then you launched a cloud offering and it did really well. And now you're just focused on the cloud, like the cloud service. But do you think that do you think PostHog could have been built the way it is now without those Ukrainian pizza chains along the way?
No. Yeah, I mean, like, it would be much harder. Basically, had I been able to like fundraise tens of millions of dollars and convince, and then just like hire a whole team and then just like build by ourselves and just ship like 10 products in one, or like we have 8 products now, so build 8 products from scratch without really much validation, like perhaps we could have done this, but like it's a particularly unappealing style of startup to build from scratch to go multi-product because you have to build everything. And that's, and like the fundamental problem of startup is like, does anyone care? And it doesn't, the two feel like conflicting. Like it's pretty hard to, like, if your goal is to figure out as quickly as possible if anyone cares, and then your goal is also to build like multiple products, each with $1 billion competitor to compete with them, you're gonna have it's like, feels like a huge gamble. So I think it would have been way harder. So just so we had a little bit of traction and a bit of a following, which I think made it easier. Again, a good quote actually I had from Ali, who I mentioned, was, as you get like, once you have a bunch of users, you start being able to see round corners. You just have much more insight into. It's so hard to get any insight in the early days. Like in the early days, it's like I'm like harassing people on LinkedIn to use our stuff one at a time. Everyone's ignoring me, and maybe I get like a meeting every now and again.
Where I'm at the moment.
Whereas now the change is like, man, if we post something, like it can just wind up on like, it'll wind up on social media and stuff without doing anything, and a whole load of people will react to it and all sorts. So it's made it easier. I couldn't have figured out the correct strategy. So the answer is actually no. Like I could not have figured out the correct strategy with the information I had at the time. Like I had to like do something. And the problem we picked was close enough to the correct strategy that we're able to get from that to a strategy that's better.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what are like the kind of examples of like seeing around a corner?
An example would be, we have tons of like lots of users were asking to stream data from PostHog to a data warehouse. And we're like, oh, okay. Like we kind of understand. Like they told us, the users were like, this is because we want to join our product data with our revenue data. Like we want to analyze our highest paying customers, for example, or customers who aren't paying anything or whatever. And like there's a bunch of other data we also want to join with to get more insight. And like, cool. Okay, so our users have told us that. So we built exports to data warehouses. And they're like, oh, like tons of people are using this, like loads and loads and loads, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably like now thousands of companies are doing that with us. So we're like, oh, well, like let's just build a warehouse because like everyone's streaming data to a warehouse. And like we've actually seen some companies that blew up, like they totally rocketed in their growth on us. Like, the first bill was nothing. Then the next bill was $400, and then the next bill was $9,000. And it went all the way up to like $50,000 a month someone was spending with us, as one example. And then they moved to a data warehouse and the modern data stack. And we're like, oh, like we just should really build this because we are going to churn people who blow up in usage. Like the exact people we'd want to retain are the exact ones we'll lose.
Yeah.
And we think this whole modern data stack is super messy and complicated and dumb. And we'll just build the whole thing in one place. And we won't build it for like Shell or JP Morgan. We'll build it for like these startups that are growing quickly, that are quite small teams still. They might have like 30 people or 100 people or whatever. But again, we wouldn't have even realized the modern data stack was kind of like a thing because we're not data engineering, data analyst people. But our users kind of pulled us there, and then we did something about it. Like we just shipped it, and now we have our own data warehouse for customers to use, and we've got early customers on it and so on. So it's just like one example, but like we've never realized that because we just had a lack of like industry knowledge, I guess, until we had users.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's very so you're like kind of just being pulled by them as to what they want you to do, and then thinking about.
Yeah, you can kind of just gauge like the market much better. I know it's the same with like, another example now is like we just have a public roadmap. So we just list like this is stuff we think about building. And like it gives us a really early, like it gives us like a little group of users to talk to early on, and we get like a rough sense of what people actually want. And it often contradicts what you would expect to feel. Like one of our developers wants to build we've had an item, we haven't got feature flag support for Java, like we haven't got an SDK for it. And like I think the engineer who runs feature flags is like, I really just don't like working with Java. But the thing has like 270 upvotes or something. So it's like, we probably should just build it. So I think, we can get a signal. We can kind of use the community and website and stuff as like a signaling mechanism to give us a little bit more insight into what to do. Too. So yeah, it's like a lot easier getting this right. The problems go from being very existential to being quite much narrower. Like it goes from like, am I trying to build like a bicycle or a marshmallow factory or a shed? All the way down into now it's like, which SDK do we prioritize for implementation out of Java and like Rust or something? So yeah, the problems are like so much narrower, and so it's two things. It's like more narrowly defined problems, and lots of users to actually run them by. So it gets exponentially easier as you get bigger, I think.
Yeah, it feels like, and that kind of like ties in a little bit to how you run PostHog as well. And you were mentioning just off the call about how you built the session replay, which is the feature that I installed today.
Yeah.
How could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So back in the day, PostHog is just product analytics and open source and self-hostable. So we have like a paid self-hosted product and whatever. And we did a hackathon, and one of our engineers decided that he would build session recording, so the ability to watch like little video clips of your users using your product or your website. I thought, man, I think the other tools in that industry are kind of lame. They kind of feel a bit cheap to me somehow. I'm not sure. Like, it's a bit invasive. Like, I'm not sure if developers will like it or take it seriously. It feels like a marketing-y thing to do. But the way we work is if an engineer wants to build X and I want to build Y, we will build X. Because also you can't get people's best work. It was sort of my belief going into it anyway. I'm like, well, if he really enjoys it, like, he'll probably do a really good job. And like, who knows what will come from it. And so he shipped it, and it completely transformed our entire business. So he just built it. He built it because like a few users were asking for it. It just felt like one of those features that you should obviously ignore, because it was like a different product to the one we were working on.
Yeah.
But anyway, he built it, immediately got a lot of usage. And now, a few years later, every company on earth that does product analytics has basically copied and done this, because it's so useful having it together. And that shipping that product made us realize, oh, hang on, we can actually, like, people really like us because we're multi-product. Then we started charging for it separately, and then we realized, oh, this is great, because now we actually got more usage when we started charging for it. It went from being like a feature that was free, was the perception of it, to like, oh no, it's a distinct standalone session recording tool that can compete with like Hotjar or Full Story. Because there's pricing attached to it, it feels legit. And then we got more usage and much harder feedback from people, which meant the product quality went up because we could like invest in it properly because we're making money, and we had good feedback that was more demanding. And so the like usage went up, the quality went up, and the revenue went up by charging for it too. So kind of treating it as a first class product. And then we replicated this we started looking at like all the other tools, and we think there's like at least 30 and probably more like 50 or 60 plus that we could build like this. And then now we have 8 products. We're trying to build the next 5. And like none of this would have happened. And then this meant we could compete in cloud because we were really differentiated by being wider. So it like enabled an awful lot. And it just comes from like listening to developers who have experience.
Yeah. And how, like, this guy who came up with this, who wanted to build it, like, how do you think about, like, is he like now still running the session replay part, or is he like, what else have you got? What else do you want to build?
It comes from all over the place, though, like these ideas. So he actually left because he was ill. But he we've just repeatedly had this kind of thing happen. So to give you another example, there's a guy called Marius, who until very recently ran our product analytics team. He now runs a different team. And you think, okay, the person that runs product analytics, like, what are they going to be working on? And you kind of would assume like more filters or like more visualization types or something, bugs, scalability. But no, Marius was like, I'm going to build HogQL. I'm like, what is that? And he's like, well, I'm going to build this like middleware layer that like that standardizes all of our querying between our front end and our database. And it will like rewrite SQL in a like nice format for ClickHouse, which is the database we use. And everyone was like, here are like 90 reasons why this is a dumb idea. And like, it won't work and it'll be terrible. It's a ridiculous amount of scope. And his idea kind of got really shredded internally. And in reaction to this, he basically just stayed up until 3 a.m. for 3 days and built it and came back with it. And then
just hero coded.
Everyone was like, oh, actually, this is working and it operates. It then took another 6 months to get into production or something like that. But now it's completely transformed how we build. Like now everything sits on top of this thing. We can ship new visualization types. We can embed visualizations really easily across the product set and so on. And now his whole bag is like, he's in charge of building. He wants to build, at the moment, he's literally building a new programming language for us for a bunch of similarly crazy sounding reasons. And with that, he will then build 2 more products. Because you want to like build a fuller featured CDP and a messaging tool. And he's like, this programming language is designed to make it easier to ship these products. So again, this is only the kind of thought that like an engineer will have. It will not come from a product manager ever. It has to become very technical for these ideas. But it's going to happen repeatedly. So yeah, you just have to sort of back people a little bit to do this. That takes courage. Like, it doesn't feel intuitive to, you have your agenda, you have what you've told venture capitalists you're going to do with the business, and then engineers will just come up with random stuff that may not sound like what an investor would want to hear, but we've just stopped caring at this point. And our engineers are very close. They are similar people to our customers, and they're working directly with our customers, and they're working directly with our code. So they're probably the best place to decide what to build pretty frequently.
Yeah, and now does it feel like, oh, that's not the right thing to do, or is it like you're so used to, like, you see their perspective now, or is it like fully like you're like, I don't think that's a good idea?
It's taken me years.
I'm just going to trust you.
Yeah, it's taken me a couple of years to like build the trust to do it. Maris pushed the concept that Maris talks about is in stand-up in comedy, there's the concept of yes and so by default an organization will be no but. Like, someone suggests something and you will sit there and you will say, here are 20 reasons why this is dumb. Like, I'm going to play devil's advocate or whatever, and everything gets torn apart. And then you do that repeatedly and people just stop suggesting ideas because there's no point. It takes energy to suggest ideas, and like, people have to put their stuff on the line. And so that's why organizations get boring and crappy when they're big and stop building new things. And so we've been like, okay, no, this is actually very important. Like, this has been a good example of like, no, I'm going to push for like yes and as the culture. So by default, you need to encourage new ideas to be built, and regardless, you don't need consensus to ship them. It does kind of mean, but I think it's a really important cultural point. There's some stuff on, like, I think Pixar has this concept of like ideas are fragile, which is pretty similar, where you really have to like be encouraging, especially as you get bigger and you have lots of users and stuff. You have to go out of your way to encourage ideas rather than everything getting a bit sensible and boring, and then you hitting some local maxima with what you're working on. Yeah,
and then you have to have like innovation days and sort of
yeah, exactly.
That was actually like really mind blowing, because I noticed like I feel like I can be like that sometimes with like shut down stuff rather than like I'll have my own idea of like, okay, we want to do this and this, and then okay, that was a learning for me right there. And one of the things on that strand of like fun, it sounds like it's kind of almost like a frivolous thing, but I think it's actually important. And you've written about this in an article about like taking fun seriously, and how Elon Musk says the most entertaining outcome is the most likely.
yeah, if you're expecting, like, if you're having fun, like, basically, if you're okay, so a story. My co-founder and I have this exec coach because we're like living stereotypes of founders, and he's super expensive, super great, and competent, whatever. And we went, and he's coached. I think he's coached 23 or 24. I don't think he's like public. I'm not really sure if he's like public about it. He's coached 20. So I'm not going to name him, but he has like 23 or 24 founders who've built unicorn companies, and some of them are like big,
Wow.
like they're much bigger than like $1 or $2 billion valuation. Like they're like an order of magnitude more. We went out for dinner with him after we've been working with him for like 6 months or something, and we're like, "What's the difference between someone that builds a $50 billion business compared to like a $1 or $2 billion company?" And he's like, "Well, basically, the ones that build the biggest companies like working in them, and like they don't look normal." And so I'm like, "Yeah, I can kind of see why. Like, it just takes a long time to build a big business. So if you hate your job, you're not going to get there." And I could so easily see how like, oh, great, we get to like 100 million revenue, then we cash out or whatever, and then the whole company kind of falls apart because we've like just about dragged ourselves there, and now everything's like churning. I think it happens a lot when people go public, or certainly when they sell. Even when it's like a good exit kind of thing, this like repeats it. This cycle happens every time almost. But then there are exceptions, and so we've been like, well, we're not here to build like a $1 or $2 billion business, and like it's not that far from where we are, and these like little point solutions we're competing with are worth that much. Like, let's try and go like bigger. And you know, if we sold the company tomorrow, I'd just be building a startup the day after from scratch. The first bit's super crappy. So yeah, I think like fun sort of means that like people stick it out more. It means you get better work from people because they're enjoying what they're doing, really simplistically. So it's like a matter of pride starts motivating people. Like we have this with our website. Like our website was quite fun to work on, and you can just tell when you
very fun. It's a good.
But the team that work on it are incredibly motivated because it is just kind of like that. And it just means the standard you can just push really far. So like it's kind of easier to push people when they're having fun, whereas if they're having a bad time, like you can't push people to deliver world-class work, I think. Not like on a long-term basis. And then also like simply not churning really strong people is a very basic way to keep high shipping speed up. So like listen to them, trust them, give them autonomy, and they'll stick around, and like probably they're better than you anyway quite often. So like this stuff I think really matters, and it's even better if you can get it across to your users too and get kind of marketing benefit from it as a secondary thing. But yeah, just keeping it a little bit interesting just makes it so much nicer to work here long term. That's kind of the core reason why like our business strategy is like kind of based around this. Like we didn't want to do the self-hosted thing long term because it just felt like it was going to be a huge drag. Like I don't really want to fly around the world in a suit saying sorry to customers that there's some problem with their infrastructure, there's having issues scaling everything or whatever. So but we had to like do it a little bit to kind of realize that's not what we wanted to do that much. The cloud product and having a very quick self-serve motion was much more appealing. So yeah, I think fun is not necessary if you want to build a big business. But I think if you want to build a huge business, it probably is.
That's a good takeaway, and it's probably good for living a long time and just having a good life as well, I guess.
Yeah, maybe unless you get into drugs or something. Depends what you
find. Not too much fun.
Yeah, everything in moderation.
Yeah. Everything in moderation. Yeah, make a fun SaaS website. That's the kind of fun you should aim for.
Yeah, fun as long as it's like a B2B fintech or something.
Yeah.
This is a bit like how learning can be fun, isn't it? It sounds pretty lame now I'm talking about it out loud.
No, it's great. It's great. James, I think that's a wrap on time. I know you've got it's late in the UK, so it's probably bedtime. But thank you so much for
certainly not
certainly not. Okay,
more stuff to do today. I've got plenty of work. I stop in the afternoon and I work late at night like a weirdo because my kids are asleep, and it's much better than rushing and trying to wrap up by 5 or 6 or something.
Well, working anyway.
Yep.
And sorry, and before you go, if you got anything that like you want to talk about PostHog or like
just buy PostHog.
Buy PostHog.
No, nothing more to add.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, James. This was really, really fun. Yeah, thank you, and hope everyone goes and installs PostHog.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, James.